Okay, so we're going to be going to look through the sugya of te'ima. Okay, so this is of tasting in halacha. That's the sugya that we're looking at, and what's going to be different than what you might be used to in a lot of the later shiurim that like the more modern shiurim. I didn't say modern, but like contemporary shiurim of today, is that what usually you see in shiurim is that the Maggid Shir will go through a sugya, they'll go through a certain topic, and then what they'll do is they'll bring up, let's say, a question, and then they'll take 3 or 4 different places where where this question exists and applies, and then what they'll do is they'll say, okay, we have 2 ways of understanding this topic. You can understand the topic this way, or you can understand the topic that way. And then they'll plug it back into the 4 different places of halacha where they mentioned, like the 4 different areas of halacha they mentioned. And then they'll say, okay, you can see how, let's say, the Magen Avraham decided this way because he has this understanding of the Gemara, and you see the Taz understands it the other way because they have a different understanding of the Gemara. So you have, and that's usually how we're going to do something different. We're going to start off with a question, but the question is really not important. The question is just to grab your attention. There's no real, the point of this is not the question. We're not going to try to answer the question. We're not going to try to understand where the question came from. And then we're gonna look at 4 different areas where 3 different areas where this topic comes up, and where tasting in halacha comes up. And then what we're going to do is, after we've looked at the different areas of halacha, then what we're going to try, what our goal for this shiur, and our goal that we're trying to achieve here, is an understanding of what tasting in halacha is. Because what does that mean to taste in halacha? Why is tasting any different than just eating, right? So we're going to look for the nature. It's a conceptual idea of what tasting is, not a practical idea. We're not looking for a practical sock of what to do when tasting. Okay, so I just make sure that that's clear. What we're trying to do is get a conceptual understanding of how tasting works in halacha and what the idea of tasting is. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the first source here. Okay, and the first source is like this. This is the Magen Avraham in Hilchos Shabbos, and he says, mitzvah litom tavshilin, v'tzarich litom mikol tavshil be'erev Shabbos. So he says that there's a mitzvah to taste the food on Erev Shabbos, and so on Erev Shabbos you should taste from every single dish of food. Right? That's a mitzvah. You're cooking a bunch of, you got your cholent, you have your chicken soup, you have your kugel, right? So you taste a little of it to make sure that it's good. The Shulchan Aruch says that shuri b'tanis yochel etom kedei rabius, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins that on a fast day you can taste up to a ravius of food. Okay. Again, you're fasting, but you can taste up to. But on condition that you spit it out, that you don't swallow it. Okay. Now you can't do that on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. That's for like the minor fast. The next one coming up at this point of the year is Tzom Gedalia. You'd be able to taste the food to make sure it's okay, but you'd have to spit it out. Okay, says the Shulchan Aruch. And the Ramah says Yesh Mechmir b'kol tanis sibor v'achi nogen. The Ramah says that's Ashkenazim don't do this. We don't do this on fast days. We don't start tasting food. We're not messing around, and it doesn't make a difference what tanis sibor it is. Right? We don't do this. So whether it's Tisha B'Av or it's Tzom Gedalia, Tanis Esther, we're not tasting any foods. Okay. Mishnah Berurah says v'hachi nogen v'makom sudas mitzvah shemevashim biyom b'tzarach halayla yishlis mochadai rishona v'hatir. Okay. V'shari tanisam litom atashil ma'at ma'at v'yesh bo melach v'tavlin u'v'liflot. So he says that Mishnah Berurah says, well, hold on a second. Let's differentiate here between a dish that you're eating for the purposes of a sudas mitzvah that will be once the fast is broken. So let's imagine, for instance, you're making a bris milah, a circumcision party, and so you do the circumcision on the fast day. There's no reason to push off the actual bris milah, but the party that you're going to have, so that you're going to have only when the fast is over. So for the break fast is going to be having a full meal for the bris. That's what your Sudas Mitzvah is going to be. So then you'd be allowed, says the Mishnah Berurah, to taste the food. Okay. So then again, right? Normally you wouldn't be, but he says you could rely now on the opinions of the Shulchan Aruch, and as opposed to the Ramah, and you're allowed to now take you're allowed to take a taste of the food, as long as it's for this Sudas Mitzvah. All right, so now the question would become, right? So what about on Erev Shabbos, like this year? The fast of the 10th of Teves, we're a couple months away from it. The fast of the 10th of Teves will fall out on Erev Shabbos. It's the only fast day that we allow to fall out on Erev Shabbos. So that's going to fall on Erev Shabbos. So would you be allowed to, on Friday afternoon, you're cooking, because you have Shabbos that night, even though it's a fast day on Erev Shabbos, you're cooking for Shabbos. Would you be allowed, normally every Erev Shabbos, like we saw, you're allowed to you're allowed to taste the food. So would you be allowed on Erev Shabbos of that falls out on Asar B'Teves, would you be allowed to taste the food for Shabbos that night? So it would seem for the Mishnah Berurah that you'd be allowed to, because that's a Shabbos meal, it's a Sudas Mitzvah. So you'd be allowed to taste it even on the fast day, as long as you spit it out. Okay, that's that's what it seems to be. But it opens up the question again. I want to make sure this question about whether or not you can taste food on Erev Shabbos that's the Asar B'Teves. So this question is not the question I'm looking to answer. Okay, I'm not looking to answer that question. That's not the question that concerns me. The answer is pretty simple. The answer, it seems from the Mishnah Berurah, that yes, you'd be allowed to taste it as long as you spit it out. My question is, this is just one area where we see, if I would ask you if you're allowed to taste eat the food, right? Are you allowed to eat the food that you prepared? So that you look at me like I was crazy for even asking the question. Yeah, what are you talking about? Are you allowed to eat the food, right? That's nuts. But tasting the food is allowed. So conceptually, how does Halacha view tasting food, right? How does Halacha view tasting food on a conceptual level? How do we understand this? So that's really the question that I'm looking for. Okay. Now the Gemara, we're going to look at the Gemara here in source number 4, and this is where the sugya really opens up. It's the basis of the entire sugya of te'i masochel, of eating the food. The Gemara says like this: Okay, so he says Hashuri b'tanis ma'ushiyato. Somebody that's fasting, are they allowed to taste the food? Okay. So he accepted upon himself not to eat and drink. He's not doing that. Oh, Dilma, or maybe he said that he doesn't want to get any benefit, right, from food and drink. Maybe that's what it was. And that he is benefiting from, right? The taste he's tasting the food, and that taste is providing him with some hana. So the Gemara says, "Amarle toim ve'im kachlum." He can eat and it doesn't mean anything. It's not, he hasn't violated the laws of the fast day by eating. It's perfectly permissible for him to eat. So the Gemara says, "Amarle toim ve'im kachlum." Tani nami hachi. The same way that we learned that a person could taste food on a fast day and there's no big deal. So same thing. Mitames eina tuna bracha. Same thing is that when you're tasting that food. Right, so the image we should have in our minds is somebody standing over the stove. There's soup simmering, and you stick your spoon in. Right, the spoon's going to be less than the revius that we talked about before. So you're just taking a little bit because you just want to taste it to make sure it's properly spiced and it's cooking fine. So now you don't make a bracha on that tasting, okay? Because you're tasting the food, so you dip it in, and you don't say a shahakol before you. Or a dama before you eat the soup, you simply eat without making a bracha. Okay, but shuri b'tani soim kachlum kama. Right. So and now, how much can you eat? How much can you taste? So you sit down for a full meal. Say, I'm only tasting this. Right. So he says, Rabbi Yasi tame ad shur v'yasa. So they would eat up to a revius of food, and that's it. Okay. So the Gemara, right? The Gemara hangs the question on eating, on whether you accepted not to eat and drink or not to get benefit, right? That's what the that's what the Gemara is hanging this debate about. Okay, if the fast is from food and drink, then tasting doesn't qualify as eating or drinking food, and so you'd be allowed to taste. Now, if it's about getting benefit, the tasting does give you benefit, and you wouldn't be allowed to taste the food on a fast day. So the Gemara answers that you can taste right on a fast day. It's not a problem. But the Gemara also says you can only have a revius. Okay. So now the Gemara is clearly looking at eating and tasting as dissimilar in two different ways. You can't eat on a fast day, and you have to make a bracha when you eat. The Gemara is saying you can taste on a fast day, and you don't make a bracha. So it's clear that it's viewing the Gemara is viewing tasting much different than we would expect. So that leads us to a question. Okay, so what's the nature of tasting food? And how does it differ from eating food? The Gemara has conceptual understanding of tasting, which is different than eating. Right? There's a conceptual idea, and all ideas. Okay, this is what a svar is. Okay, that's the question of does he. What's the understanding of tasting? What is tasting? Right? And so if you would explain the nature of tasting and the nature of eating, how would they be different? What's the difference between them? Again, not practically. We're looking for the nature of tasting and the nature of eating. What's the difference? Okay. So now the Tosfos here has a very interesting comment. Tosfos qualifies the Gemara, and it's easy to see where Tosfos got this from the words that the Gemara uses. Right? This is going to sound like at first Tosfos is pulling this out of nowhere, but in reality, we see Tosfos has a very good reason for saying what he says. He says like this. He says, "Oh, Dilmahana Kibale," right? So he says maybe that the person accepted not to eat, but not to get benefit. So Tosfos says, "Hi lishna mashma demari b'tanis yachid." It seems to be from the Gemara that this person is on a personal fast. He's accepted upon himself a personal fast, but this is not a fast day that shows up on the calendar. Right? This is just a personal fast. So aval b'tanis akasiv lo, but when it comes to a regular tanis, so a regular fast day, you would not be allowed to taste. So it also says this whole idea that you can taste food on a fast day, that only applies when you've accepted a personal fast. There's a halacha that you could accept upon yourself a personal fast. That's something that's okay in halacha to do. The mincha before the fast, there's a text that you use, a girsa, and you accept the fast upon yourself, and then you fast. You fast for whatever conditions you put on your fast. You fast, and that fast, that person, no one else is fasting. It's just you. That fast, you'd be allowed to taste on. But to fast on a Tzom Gedaya and a Tanis Esther, so that he seems to say you cannot go ahead and do that. You can't do. Okay, so now the Meiri says as follows. He doesn't agree with Tosfos on this. He says, "Umixas gone svar kasvu shlo hikilu b'kach el b'tanis yachid ha b'tanis sibor o echad b'tanis ksuvim lo." Right, so he quotes their opinion that they don't allow tasting for he quotes Tosfos. You don't allow tasting on a fast day that's written in halacha. It's just an individual one, right? Individual fast. So now the Meiri says after quoting Tosfos, he says Ve'eni roa ma hefresh ben zeh. I don't see what the difference is between this tasting on a regular fast day, on a fast day that shows up on the calendar, and tasting on a fast day that it's just your personal fast. If you taste on a fast day, you can taste on a fast day. What's the difference of the nature of the fast day, right? So that's the question. Okay, so we want to know. Right, our question is what's the debate about between the Meiri and Tosfos about what type of fast day this license to taste food applies to, That's what we want to know, right? What's the debate here? Okay, what's the debate about what type of fast the license to tasting applies? Why does Toso say that it's only a fast that's a personal fast, and Miri says it could be any fast whatsoever. Okay. So let's just review what we've done to this point. Okay, to this point, we've looked at the question of what the nature of tasting is. We see that tasting is different than eating. We know that tasting is different than eating because halacha treats them differently, right? There's times where you'd never be allowed to taste food or eat food. So you'd never be allowed to eat food. I'm on a fast day. And all of a sudden, the halacha is that you're allowed to taste it, right? That's the halacha. You're allowed to taste food. So tasting and eating is different. We want to understand conceptually what the difference is between them, right? And then we saw the Gemara, and then we saw Machlokes Tosos and Miri as to what the actual debate. Well, excuse me, Tosos and Miri about whether or not this is referring to a public fast day or an individual fast day. That's the question. Okay, so let's stop here. This is a good place to stop. We've seen one of the three nafkamis, the practical differences between a tasting and eating, and so now we've got some sort of a idea of it. We're going to see a bunch more, and again, we're striving towards that conceptual understanding of what tasting food is all about. Okay. We'll stop here. At Beli Neder, we shall continue next